Welcome friends to this video where I will be narrating the story of Moses as I share my drawings of him the past couple weeks. The reason I'm sharing the story of Moses is that he is a character in the Bible that inspires me. Although Moses wasn't perfect, he was a tremendous leader in the Bible. Moses was humble and trusted God. When I run into hardship, I'm often reminded of how Moses handled adversity. In order to understand why God doesn't give up on Moses and his people, I want to briefly recap a couple of stories to understand God's promise and why he doesn't give up on them. In the first book of Genesis, God promised Abraham he would be the father of many nations, as abundant as the stars in the sky. Abraham put his faith in God. He was even prepared to sacrifice his son Isaac, who was the son to fulfill God's promise. God tested Abraham, but didn't make him sacrifice his son Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob, and Jacob had 12 sons. The 11th son, Joseph, was his favorite. Joseph told his brothers about his dream of them bowing down to him. His brothers didn't like him for this, so they sold him to the Egyptians as a slave. Joseph was elevated to the second in command because he was able to tell the Pharaoh the meaning of his dreams. Joseph's brothers came from Israel to Egypt because of a famine Joseph predicted from God. Joseph welcomed them and the Pharaoh invited them to stay, so they settled in Egypt. Now begins the story of Moses. After about 400 years, a corrupt Pharaoh started to put the Hebrews into slavery. The Pharaoh was afraid of anyone overthrowing him, so he ordered all male babies to be thrown into the Nile. A mother by the name of Jochebed gave birth to Moses. She was only able to hide him for a few months before she had to put him in a basket and send him down the river. The Pharaoh's daughter found Moses in the river and convinced the Pharaoh to raise him. When Moses became an adult, he saw an Egyptian beat a Hebrew slave. So he killed the Egyptian and fled to Midian. He encountered an angel of the Lord, speaking to him from a burning bush. God heard the cry of his people and called Moses to go back to Egypt to free his people. Moses didn't want to go because he didn't believe he was a good speaker. So God sent his brother Aaron with him. Moses went to Egypt to ask Pharaoh to let his people go. Pharaoh refused, so God sent plagues among the nation. Each time Moses went back to Pharaoh, he said he would let them go, but Pharaoh changed his mind. God sent a total of 10 plagues, and in the later plagues, God hardened Pharaoh's heart so that God's plan to free his people would be fulfilled. The last plague would kill the firstborn sons. The Israelites were instructed to sacrifice a lamb and wipe the blood over the doors so that their sons would be saved. This was called the Passover, and it is still celebrated today. After Pharaoh lost his firstborn, he finally let the Hebrews go. However, not long after letting them go, he changed his mind. He gathered up an army and started to chase them. Moses had led them to the Red Sea, where they were afraid because they had thought they were trapped. Moses lifted his staff and performed a miracle of parting the Red Sea. When they reached the other side, Pharaoh's army was starting to cross the river. Moses lowered his staff and the Red Sea closed on the army and destroyed them. Before reaching the next stop at Mount Sinai, they had to defeat the Amalek. God helped them when Moses held up his staff by providing them with an advantage. If Moses lowered his staff, they would start to lose the battle. Aaron and Hur helped Moses hold up his staff so they could defeat the Amalek. After winning the battle, they made it to Mount Sinai, where Moses went to meet with God to receive a covenant of the 10 Commandments. The people agreed to the covenant, and shortly after this, Moses went back up the mountain for plans to build a tabernacle so they could be in God's presence. While Moses was on the mountain for 40 days, the people became impatient, so they made an idol of a golden calf to worship. When Moses came down, he saw what they were doing and threw, breaking the tablets with the commandments. Moses still asked God to be faithful to his promise and not to destroy his people, even though they remained unfaithful. God kept his promise and began to plan to dwell with them by building the tabernacle. God had Bezalel build the temple with the Ark of the Covenant. In order for them to enter the temple, they had to make an animal sacrifice for atonement. When they left Mount Sinai, they continued to complain about hunger and didn't trust God. Moses sent 12 spies to scout out the promised land. 10 of the spies said they would be conquered and should go back to Egypt. God gave them what they wanted by letting them wander in the desert for 40 years. However, God did stay faithful to his promise by leading their children into the promised land. Moses and Aaron were not allowed to enter the promised land because they stopped giving credit to God when God continued to provide for them. In the last book of Deuteronomy, Moses shares the covenant and the laws to the new generation who would enter the promised land and would be led by Joshua. Moses spends his last days at Mount Nebo. That's going to conclude my story of Moses. Hopefully you found this story and drawings inspirational to read the Torah books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Don't forget to leave any questions or comments below, and I hope to see you in the next video. Farewell.